A single coral island in the Persian Gulf controls nearly all of Iran's oil revenue. Between 90 and 96% of the country's crude exports flow through Kharg Island. That makes it Iran's most critical economic asset. And in 2026, it became the center of a military confrontation with global consequences. The United States launched a series of targeted strikes on the island. Military infrastructure was hit. Missile storage bunkers were destroyed. Naval mine depots were taken out. Radar installations went offline. Air defense systems were neutralized. But the oil export terminals remained untouched. That detail matters. It suggests the strikes were designed to apply pressure, not eliminate Iran's oil capacity entirely. The strategy appears calculated: degrade Iran's ability to defend the island without collapsing its primary source of income. That creates leverage without triggering a total economic collapse. Here's why Kharg Island is so valuable. It's a small landmass, less than 8 square kilometers, but it serves as the loading point for almost all Iranian crude destined for international markets. Pipelines run from Iran's onshore oil fields to the island's export terminals. Tankers dock there, load millions of barrels, and transport the oil across the Gulf and beyond. And without Kharg, Iran loses its primary export route. The country's budget depends heavily on oil revenue. When exports drop, the government loses funding for subsidies, infrastructure, and military operations. That makes Kharg Island both an economic engine and a strategic vulnerability. Now, here's the broader context. Kharg sits near the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow waterway is one of the most important choke points in global energy trade. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil passes through it. Any disruption in the area affects markets worldwide. The 2026 strikes on Kharg didn't just impact Iran. They sent ripples through global energy systems. Oil exports from the island slowed. Market uncertainty increased. Prices rose in response to supply concerns. Countries that rely on stable Gulf energy flows felt the impact immediately. China imports significant volumes of Iranian crude. Saudi Arabia and the UAE monitor any instability that could affect regional shipping lanes. India, Japan, and South Korea all depend on uninterrupted tanker traffic through the Gulf. A military confrontation on Kharg Island introduces risk into a system built on predictability. Here's what the strikes targeted. First, missile bunkers. Iran had positioned anti-ship missiles on the island to threaten vessels in the surrounding waters. Those weapons were a tool for asymmetric warfare. If Iran wanted to retaliate against sanctions or military pressure, it could target commercial tankers or naval assets. The U.S. strikes removed that option. Second, naval mine storage. Mines are a low-cost, high-impact defensive weapon. Iran could deploy them to block shipping lanes or complicate any effort to approach the island. Taking out the storage facilities limits that capability. Third, radar systems. Radar provides early warning and tracking for incoming threats. Without it, Iran's ability to detect and respond to airstrikes or naval operations is compromised. Fourth, air defense platforms. These systems protect the island from aerial attacks. Once they're destroyed, follow-up strikes become easier to execute. The fact that oil infrastructure was spared is the key detail. The terminals, pipelines, and loading facilities were not hit. That suggests restraint. It also suggests a specific objective. The goal wasn't to destroy Iran's oil industry, it was to weaken Iran's ability to defend it. That creates a different kind of pressure. Iran can still export oil, but it can no longer protect the island effectively. That forces a choice: rebuild defenses and risk further strikes, or accept vulnerability and negotiate. Now, here's where things get more complex. The disruption didn't just affect Iran's military posture, it affected oil flows. Even without direct damage to export facilities, the strikes created uncertainty. Tanker operators became more cautious. Insurance premiums for vessels traveling to Kharg Island increased. Some buyers delayed contracts or sought alternative suppliers. The result was a reduction in exports, even though the infrastructure remained intact. That had immediate economic consequences for Iran. Revenue dropped. The government faced budget shortfalls. Subsidies for fuel and food became harder to maintain. Public frustration grew. And internationally, the situation added volatility to energy markets. Oil prices spiked. Analysts debated whether the strikes were a one-time action or the beginning of a sustained campaign. Governments with strategic petroleum reserves considered releasing supplies to stabilize prices. OPEC members discussed production adjustments. The situation became a global issue, not just a regional one. Here's what happens next. There are 3 broad possibilities. First, continued airstrikes and economic pressure. The U.S. could maintain a strategy of degrading Iran's defenses without destroying its oil capacity. That keeps leverage in place. It avoids a full-scale war but sustains pressure over time. Iran, in this scenario, faces a slow erosion of its defensive capabilities. It can rebuild, but each reconstruction effort becomes a target. The economic strain continues. Export capacity remains under threat. Revenue stays unstable. Second, direct seizure of the island. This is a more aggressive option. If the US or a coalition decided to occupy Kharg Island, it would gain control over Iran's primary export route. That would give outside powers leverage over Iran's economy without needing to maintain constant airstrikes. But it would also require holding the island, which introduces logistical and political risks. An occupation would likely trigger a strong response from Iran. It would also complicate relationships with other Gulf states and global powers like China and Russia. Third, negotiations driven by economic strain. If the strikes succeed in applying enough pressure, Iran might seek a diplomatic resolution. The loss of defensible export capacity could push Tehran toward talks. Those negotiations could involve sanctions relief, security guarantees, or broader regional agreements. This outcome depends on whether the economic pain outweighs the political cost of compromise. Each scenario carries risks. Continued strikes could escalate into broader conflict. Seizure could trigger a regional war. Negotiations could fail if neither side is willing to make concessions. But all three possibilities revolve around the same strategic reality. Kharg Island is small, but its role is outsized. It's the valve that controls Iran's oil revenue. Disrupt the island, and you disrupt the economy. Control the island, and you control Iran's primary income source. That makes it a leverage point, unlike almost any other. Here's why this matters beyond Iran. Energy markets are global. A disruption in the Gulf affects prices in Europe, Asia, and North America. Countries that depend on stable oil supplies watch the situation closely. China has invested heavily in Iranian energy infrastructure. A prolonged conflict around Kharg threatens those investments. Saudi Arabia and the UAE compete with Iran for influence in the region. Instability on Kharg shifts the balance of power. India and other major importers must consider alternative supply routes if Gulf exports become unreliable. The ripple effects extend into trade, inflation, and geopolitical alignments. A single island, less than 8 square kilometers, influences decisions made in capitals around the world. That's the paradox of Kharg Island. Its size is tiny. Its strategic weight is massive. The 2026 strikes demonstrated that reality. They didn't destroy the island. They didn't eliminate Iran's oil industry. But they exposed a vulnerability that can be exploited. And that vulnerability has consequences far beyond the Persian Gulf. What happens next will depend on how the US, Iran, and other regional powers respond. But one thing is clear. Kharg Island is more than just an oil terminal. It's a pressure point in a much larger confrontation, and control over that pressure point will shape the future of energy security, regional stability, and global markets.